So yeah, the title is The Necessity of Economic Pluralism, and I forgot that we'd agreed that title, and I saw it. I thought, oh no, what have I put myself in for there? But we'll come to that question, because obviously necessity is something that's quite hard to argue. But let's give it a go. So I'm going to start off with, as it says here, a provocation. By the way, can you see the bar? Or that get disappearing?
I can see.
Okay, there we go. That's better. Yeah. So I'll start with a provocation, and it's only a gentle provocation. So if you don't really agree with this, that's fine. And there are plenty of things here that you could argue against. I just wanted to sort of say, well, we've got, I think most heterodox economists would agree with this statement, but not all. And it's not meant to. I'm not claiming here that mainstream economics is the same thing as neoclassical economics or anything like that. But I would say that there's a sort of core of mainstream economics, and there's diversity within that core. But there are certain principles that sort of underpin it. So things like it's a market economy, reaches an efficient equilibrium. It somehow brings about good outcomes. The way into thinking about that is to focus on the individual, and we're using tools, mathematical and statistical tools, to do that. Now, as I say, that there are variations around this, and there are new developments in these areas all the time. Behavioral economics, information economics, for instance, have raised questions around the rational choice and how feasible that is. But they still kind of have in the background this idea of the individual that can make these really good decisions, even as a sort of benchmark against which we can measure real behavior. So there's a statement. What I'm going to say afterward, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter whether you agree with this or not too much. This is just to get us going. And the more importantly, the point is that these types of views that are not in this mainstream are arguably structurally disadvantaged in terms of hiring and promotion and publication and that kind of thing. And it's not a conspiracy or the actions of any individuals. It's just how the structure of the discipline work. So the question is, why should we bother with these alternatives? So other perspectives, these are just a few of them. There are some very well-established ones, like post-Keynesianism, associated with people like Keynes and Kalecki and Joan Robinson. And then you've got others which are a bit newer, such as feminist economics or ecological economics. I was intrigued by you've got Sarah Stevano coming soon. She's excellent, so I recommend her. And she's going to talk to you about feminist economics. So there are these perspectives are out there, but as I said, they tend to be sort of structurally disadvantaged and sort of kept out of that mainstream. Although occasionally, sometimes elements of these find their way in. Okay, so the question is, why bother with these alternatives? So why bother with pluralism? Well, let's start with something that's nothing to do with economics at all. Now you should be able to see a black screen now. That's not a fault. What this means is that we've now gone into the dark. You're now in the dark. You've entered a dark room. You've got no visual aids, and there are a few of you. You bump into various objects in the room. So one of you might come across some sort of smooth conical object and think, what is this? Some sort of horn. One of you might come across a rough, hard surface and think, oh, is that some sort of wall? You might find sort of large, round, solid objects on near the ground and think, oh, what are these tree trunks? And you might find a sort of long strand of something with spikes at the end and think, maybe this is some kind of brush. And you might even hear some breathing, or you might notice some movement, or you might smell something. Now, each individual has those insights, but I would say that none of those individuals is going to necessarily correctly identify that this is an elephant, which I imagine you all worked out. It's an elephant. The point being that all those angles were necessary to reach that conclusion. Okay. if we were in the light, we might have the same issue. If we're looking at a particular angle, we might see this. We might see this. We might think this is some sort of leaf, perhaps. We might think this looks a bit like the surface of the moon, or some waste ground. Again, these could look a bit like tree trunks. And again, looking at only one of those things might lead you to the wrong conclusion. Only by looking at it all together and conferring about that and thinking about things from different angles are you going to reach that conclusion, the correct one, that it is an elephant. Okay, and there's another angle of the whole elephant, or most of the elephant, from a particular perspective. Obviously, we can now see what that rough area was at the top of its head. We can now see the tusks. We can now see a couple of those tree trunk type things. We can see how the bits relate to each other. We can see the proportions of things together. So we're now getting a much bigger, much better picture of that thing, that elephant. But obviously, we're still only getting a partial picture. We don't, if we have this angle, obviously it's a different elephant, but it's still an elephant. We can now see how those bits relate to each other. We can see something about the proportions across the whole body. Importantly, we can see that it's a quadruped, and it's walking on. It's walking on all fours. It's not just got four limbs like a human does. It's walking on all fours, and it's got that long thing at the front, which looks like a nose, which we know is a trunk. So we can now see how all those different bits fit together across the entire elephant, and we can now see something about its proportions and how it walks, or how we think it walks, etc. We can also, from this picture, see something about where it lives, its surroundings, and that might be quite useful information as well. So what this does is shows us that from that angle we get a certain amount of information, but from this angle we get a lot more information, and actually combining the two gives us a much fuller picture. Okay. Of course, we can go a lot further than that. We can see the elephant as a whole, but we can also go inside the elephant. So we can see its organs, we can see its skeletal structure, we can see it's got a tibia and fibula and a patella like a human does. We can see that it's got the same kind of reproductive organs and digestive tract and those kind of things, and a brain. And we can see how all those different bits are located next to each other. And that gives us some sort of idea as to how the elephant as a system works. And that's really useful. And that sort of allows us to give us another layer of understanding about how the elephant works, what it is, etc. But remember, we still need to bear in mind that it's within that external shell. So it's about the connection between that shell and also what's inside that helps us build up a fuller picture of that elephant. Okay. This image is again telling us something slightly different. It's showing us, it's not a video, but it's showing us something about how the elephant moves. We can also, not in this picture, but we can in other pictures see how it eats and other things that it does. But even this picture shows us something about the growth of elephants. So we've got bigger elephants and smaller elephants. They're walking in a line, so that tells us something about their social structures. It tells us something about how they move around. There might be reasons for that. We can see that the smaller elephants are sort of surrounded by the bigger ones, so there's an element of danger to the group. It may also, if we observe them a bit more, tell us something about hierarchies and social norms within that elephant group. And again, what this is doing is building up that picture of what an elephant is in a way that simply looking inside or simply looking at the outside wouldn't do. It's giving us a much richer picture. We can even see something about, the size of the elephant and how it might be affecting the ground, therefore its ecological footprint, if you excuse the pun, and also the fact that there are the birds around the elephant tell us something about how the elephant relates to other species and therefore its role in the wider ecosystem. Okay, so hopefully you can see where I'm going with all this, that in order to get a full picture of this thing that we're interested in, the elephant, we need to take a number of different perspectives. We maybe need to change perspectives. We need to go sometimes deeper in and step back at other times. We need to change where we're starting from. We need to look for different elements of what's going on with the elephant, including its social context and how it interacts with others. So this is, well, hopefully this is a nice, elegant segue into why we need pluralism in economics, because obviously what I'm suggesting is that the elephant is a bit like the economy. So in terms of general arguments for pluralism, the first one I've presented is what we might call an ontological argument. In other words, an argument about the way the world is. Okay, so we have a complex object, the elephant. Also, the elephant lives in a complex group within a bigger ecosystem. So that's an even more complex object. And what we've suggested is that the complexity of the object means that we need these different perspectives to understand the objects fully as we can. Okay, so that's why I've been going on for 5 minutes or 10 minutes about elephants. But there are also other types of arguments for pluralism in economics. So the economy is a complex thing. It's comprised of other complex things. So one way of looking at it is that's probably not going to give us all the insight that we need. We need multiple ways, of course, including other disciplines to help us understand how that economy works. But just within economics, we can also make arguments based upon epistemology, in other words, the theory of knowledge, how knowledge works. And what epistemology tells us is that there are limits to knowledge of any one type. There's limits to knowledge of coming from any one view. So the front-on view of the elephant will only give us a certain amount of insight. The side-on view will only give us a certain insight. Going inside the elephant is the same. Even viewing the elephant as a group will only give us a certain level of insight. All of these are partial, and to get that full picture, you need the different elements combined. But also, framing is important. You know, where we begin, how we look at that thing, what we include and what we don't include, the assumptions that we make when we look at the elephant. So, you know, you might see that rough surface, and you might make various assumptions about why that rough surface is there. Those assumptions come from a particular worldview, which of course may be wrong. But those assumptions often drive the conclusions that you reach. So to avoid being trapped in those assumptions and those conclusions, then you step back and you change your assumptions. Okay, so all economic thinking, modeling, theorizing is always partial in the sense of being only including certain things and excluding others. And it's those things that are left out that often are very, very important. And if you can't include them all in one model or one perspective, then the argument is, well, you need to draw on other perspectives. Then you can bring those other things in that you can't necessarily include in the first approach. Okay. And the other argument about knowledge is that we can rarely be sure that we're absolutely right about something. So we should never be too confident that what we're saying or where we're coming from is correct, and that therefore allowing us to acknowledge that and allowing other perspectives to come in is again absolutely crucial. Okay, another type of argument for these things is democratic, that actually we should be allowing a range of perspectives because those are the perspectives that people hold, and that excluding certain perspectives is potentially dangerous and undemocratic. And so we should be allowing these different views to come in, and we should be encouraging tolerance of different views, allowing people voice, and that's a good thing in itself. Okay, it's a slightly different type of argument to the other ones, but it is an argument for allowing these different perspectives or giving voice to these different perspectives. Okay, in terms of economics, what can we say? Well, maybe it gives us better economics too. And here are just a few examples. And remember what I said in the previous slide, assumptions can drive conclusions, and assumptions can lead us down one path when really we should be thinking about another path over here as well. So if, for instance, you assume, you make basic assumption that the economy is a stable object, stable system, then that's not necessarily unreasonable, but it can lead you to ignore or avoid things that you might see that suggest that the system is actually unstable, or at least has potential to be unstable. And a good example of this is with the global financial crisis of the late noughties, where basically things have been stable for quite a long time, and economists have got into the mindset that it was going to stay stable. We didn't need to worry about instabilities because it was stable. And we've seen, mainstream economists, leading mainstream economists have acknowledged that this is what they did. And they became a little bit too comfortable, and they didn't look for things that might cause problems. So the leading economist, Olivier Blanchard, talks about dark corners, that things that were hiding in dark corners were ignored. We didn't look in those dark corners. And so we missed these incredibly important things that were going on in banks and going on in rating agencies, etc. So because we weren't looking for things that could create instability, these things were missed. Okay. Now, of course, some economists did know about these things. And so people informed by the work of Hyman Minsky, for instance, understood that a system that is very stable can encourage overly risky behavior, which makes it unstable. So stability breeds instability in his work. And so those economists weren't surprised by what we saw with the global financial crisis in a way that many others were. So again, relying on one view led us into problems, whereas if we had more views at the table, we may have seen some of these things coming. And in the slide, there are a few more examples there. So if we take the view that the world, we need to look at the world as individuals, we might again miss quite important elements. So feminist economists argue that the economy is a gendered structure. Gender makes a difference. The outcomes to people will be different according to what their gender is, or what their gender role is. And so when public policy changes are brought in, it's possible, it's very easy, in fact, if you don't see the economy as a gendered object, it's very easy to miss the fact that the distribution of these policy changes might affect women rather than men, or the other way around. Okay, but if your starting assumption is that individuals are different, but they're basically just individuals, then you won't see this sort of gendered or if you like, or race, or whatever way in which you might see the economy being stratified or organized. You won't see the possibility that these outcomes could happen. Okay, and there are a couple of other examples there. For instance, housing is a real hot topic, and we hear all the time that we need to build more houses. Well, maybe, but if we understand the housing market as a complex system with cultures and agents and structures and relationships between those people, but simply building more houses is not necessarily going to solve any problems in the housing market, because it depends what type of houses they are, who buys them, where demand comes from, where credit comes from, etc. You need to understand that entire system, and just thinking about in terms of demand and supply is useful shorthand, but it's also potentially quite misleading. Okay, so I've raced through those a bit, but the point being, in all of these cases, introducing a different perspective might offer a richer insight than if we simply rely on the one. Okay. Now, I'm aware that a lot of people who watch this talk might be educationists or in education, And there are some good educational arguments for pluralism as well. So, for instance, pluralism seems to be quite popular among students. Students communicate to us that they want to hear about different views. And if that's the case, then it might make the subject more engaging, and that might allow us to achieve other goals that in education that we might want to achieve. So, for instance, if we want to get people to be independent thinkers who've got critical thinking facilities and can reach their own judgments on things, who are able, therefore, to be a bit more flexible and therefore solve problems, they might be better at getting jobs or just better at being active citizens in the world. So pluralism could mean that students are better educated and therefore better equipped for what's going on in the world than if they just look at things from one perspective. Okay, so here are, again, I'm going through these very quickly. Obviously, we can come back to any of these things if people have questions or any comments. But just laying out a few basic arguments for why pluralism might be a good thing. Okay, what I haven't done yet is sort of say, what do we mean by pluralism? We talked about different perspectives, but as is maybe appropriate, pluralism is not a single thing. Pluralism can be operate at different levels, and also there are different ways of being pluralist. And I haven't really addressed those, so I should just address those now. So, when we talk about pluralism, what do we mean by that? Pluralism of what? So, if we recognise that the world is a variegated place, that there are individuals who are different, but there are also group memberships that are different. We might talk in terms of class, that there are people who are members of particular classes, or people have particular positions in society, and that those positions give them powers, or in other words, the ability to do things that people in other parts of society don't have. So recognizing that there are differences between people is one step, and all economists recognize that. But recognizing that there might be particular clusters of different individuals who therefore end up in slightly different situations to others is not something that necessarily all economists agree on. So again, that's an area where we can say, bringing that perspective of individualism, but also bringing that perspective of groups and social classes or whatever, can also give you a different perspective, which might give you a richer understanding of how society works. So reality is varied. Different economies are different. Local economies can be different to each other. National economies can be different to each other, although they also have things in common. And it's about trying to identify what those things are in common and what common structures are creating those common things. There are also so we can have pluralism about reality, and obviously, of course, people's perspectives on reality are going to differ depending on where they are. Your understanding of how the world works is going to be conditioned to some extent by where you are in it, and that's something else that can add to our understanding, at least as a starting point for how things work. So that's reality. We can also have pluralism of methodologies. So there are different ways of thinking about the world, different ways of generating knowledge. So you might have to take a very sort of quantitative approach where you're looking at statistical modeling and you're measuring as many things as you possibly can. Or you might have a qualitative approach, which says, let's look at meanings and understand how people think about these things. And neither approach, arguably, is going to give you all the answers. A quantitative approach might allow you to identify patterns, but it's not necessarily going to tell you why those patterns are there. But combining the two together, again, that might give you a deeper insight than just using the one. Again, no method is perfect. Some methods are really good for some things, and other methods are good for other things. Okay, there's a famous Cambridge economist called Tony Lawson who talks about you might have a really good drill, and that's great for drilling things, but it's not very good for cleaning a window. So you need to pick your methods to fit the object. but also recognize that even that drill can break, or it might have the wrong drill bit, or it might be out of battery or whatever. So it may not be quite right for that particular moment. And as we've been talking already, theories have different entry points. They focus on different things. They have different sets of assumptions. They make different assumptions about the way the world works, etc. They have different assumptions about what good knowledge is and what good economics is. So these different theories are all out there. Entry points are great. They get us started. You need an entry point into inquiring about something. But if you get trapped in that entry point, that's where it can become dangerous or problematic. So this is pluralism of what? But then the question is, how do you do pluralism? Again, there are different ways of thinking about this. And I've probably been implicitly talking about one or two of these, but there's a range. There's a plurality of pluralisms. Okay, so you can have a pluralism which is quite narrow, so within one perspective. So two mainstream economists are arguing about the detail of a particular point of a theory or a particular aspect of reality, an empirical result that they found, or it could be a couple of post-Keynesian economists who are arguing about something. So you can have these disputes within one perspective, and that's still good. That's still good educationally. It's still good in terms of understanding how the world works. But in terms of pluralism, it's probably the narrowest form. Broader pluralism is where you bring in more of these different perspectives. But I should say, though, that it's still important to recognize that you can be wrong. That's an important step, right? So I'm not suggesting that everyone has to learn every theory and then has to apply every theory. Just acknowledge your own fallibility and your own possibility of being wrong, and communicating that is a step towards pluralism of a sort. Okay. Another version of pluralism, this is particularly useful when we think about how economics is taught, is where you teach different perspectives alongside each other, and say, okay, here's the thing. Now we'll teach about it from a mainstream perspective. Now we'll teach about it from a post-Keynesian perspective. Now, etc. Okay. Now this is good. It exposes people to different perspectives and gives them these different starting points. But the problem with that can be that we end up with a plurality of perspectives, but you're not really advocating for that. You don't really necessarily think it's a great thing. And these perspectives don't really interact with each other or complement each other too much. They can end up with sort of separate groups or separate ideas. They need to be brought, I would say, they need to be brought into contact with each other. So I'd say that I'm in favor of certainly when I teach, of having contending perspectives. So you teach different perspectives and then you bring them into conflict with each other or into contrast with each other. And that's where you get these debates, and there's a real engagement between the different perspectives. And another step beyond that is where you synthesize them. You say, like, let's take insights from this and this and this and this, and let's apply them all to the same object. Or you say, let's take these two perspectives and combine them into a third new perspective that's a bit more rounded than either of the other ones was. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of ways of being pluralist. We've got a whole bunch of ways of being pluralist, of what we're being pluralist about. And so even if you accept that pluralism is a good thing, you still have to think about where that pluralism applies. And of course, you can be more pluralist at one level than you are at other levels. You might say, I know what the world looks like, but I do accept that there are different theories about how you can do that. Or I very much believe in mathematics and statistical methods. So as long as we're doing that, that's fine. I'll talk about any theory that you like that uses those methods. So you can be very pluralist at one level and less pluralist at other levels. So it's complicated. Okay, I've got only a couple more slides to go. So let me just
a few more minutes, and then we'll kick into questions. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I think I'm on time. Obviously, there are people that will say, oh, hang on a minute, why do we need to do any of this? Isn't this just causing confusion or problems? yeah, maybe there are benefits, but maybe there are costs as well. So what are some of these costs? Well, or what are some of the things that might limit how pluralist people might be? Well, partly it's about people's background and their training. If you've been trained in one way of doing something, it's quite hard to get into the mindset of another perspective. If you've been learning for 5 or 10 years how to think in this perspective, how reasonable is it to go back and sort of start with another one and say, "Oh, I'll devote 5 or 10 years to that"? It's often not very practical. So it's quite hard for people, and this is not just mainstream economists; it's any economist that's been trained in a particular way of thinking for a long time. It's hard to get out of that way of thinking, even as an exercise. This is probably I should have used a different word, I think, but what I mean by this is the idea that people can take perspectives and say, "Oh yes, we've dealt with that. We do talk about that," but they talk about it in a particular way. So, for instance, the John Maynard Keynes, his ideas were very much about how in an economy there might not be enough demand to achieve full employment. He talks explicitly about how cutting wages actually won't help get rid of unemployment. In fact, it might make unemployment worse because you're taking money out of people's pockets. And yet there is an interpretation of his work which is all about how wages get stuck at a particular level and don't drop, and that's the cause of unemployment. So this, to me, this is a real misinterpretation of what he said. And I think there is a limit to pluralism, is that one perspective might say, "Oh well, we dealt with that question over here, but by doing this." But actually, you might have lost something quite important about that original perspective in translating it into your perspective. So treating things on your terms as opposed to the original terms that they were created can mean that you lose some of that meaning and therefore lose some of the benefits of pluralism. You can attempt to engage, but you can still end up with a very sort of one-sided approach. So if you remember, go back to this slide. If, for instance, you've got somebody that is really into trees and is just obsessed with trees, then they're going to see these elephants later and say, "Right, these are definitely trees. This is definitely a forest," and that's going to condition their engagement with the other people in the room. And the person who's got what turns out to be the elephant's ear, the tree person is going to say, "Well, no, it's just a big leaf. Clearly, it's a big leaf. That's what we've got, and this is just another part of the trunk, and this is some sort of fruit." And so if that person is absolutely determined to push their tree view on everybody else, then you aren't going to end up with the decision that you want. You're going to end up with "it's a tree." Okay, so pluralism doesn't guarantee that you end up with a better outcome. It depends on the dynamics of the people involved. Okay, so another thing, this is particularly important for education, is that you can end up just being really confused if you throw perspectives at people and say, "Okay, get on with it. Here are 10 perspectives. You just come back in 6 months and tell me what you think." If you're going to teach students different perspectives, it needs to be done really carefully and repeatedly, asking them to make contrasts and think about why this is different to that and why it's not. And if that's not done right, then pluralism can just lead to a confusion and then a disengagement, and it's not very good. There's an economist called Philip, or a historian of economics called Philip Murawski, and he's written about something called agnotology. And agnotology is a deliberate attempts to confuse. So if you try and create a debate where there isn't one, so you try to create the impression of a dispute where there isn't really a dispute, in order to just dissuade people from the need to do anything about that particular problem. Okay, and the example he uses is about climate change, but there are other ones that you could use. So again, if views are being expressed for sort of other reasons that are not about really understanding the world, but they're there for political reasons or exercises of power, then this can be a limit to the usefulness of having these different perspectives. And also there's something called eclecticism, which basically says you can have anything. So and there are no standards by which you can say this theory is better than that. So actually, they're all the same. So if you're looking to predict the economy, you might as well just use tea leaves because they're just as good as an economic model. And that, again, that can be a problem, because obviously then you're bringing in perspectives that don't really have any particular grounding. But again, it's hard to say we don't want that perspective in. It's not worth it. It doesn't meet our standards, because who says what the standards are? Okay, so this is there are problems with arguing for pluralism, and here are a few of them. So I said the talk was about the necessity of economic pluralism. It's quite hard to argue the necessity, because necessity says that must be the case. Like, we must have pluralism, and I'm not going to say I've proved that case. I think all I've done is tried to say here are some reasons why it might be the case. And the other thing about necessity is it's in this necessity for what? What are you trying to do? So I'm assuming that our goal is to understand the world better and improve, allow us to do things to make it better, etc. If your goals are not that, then or they're slightly different to that, or you have a different way of understanding what that means, then you may say, well, actually, I can do very well with one perspective. Thank you very much. I don't need this pluralism. I mean, so I'm not going to claim that I've shown that it is absolutely necessary. Hopefully, what I've shown is that there are good arguments for pluralism on the grounds of how the world is, how knowledge works, how methods work, and also how entry points are really useful, but they can trap us into certain conclusions. And so to guard against that, we need to step back and have a different entry point. Okay,
Brilliant.
Stop there. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much for that. Give us a kind of better understanding of, yeah, exactly as you said, the kind of need for a different perspective, and how pluralism or economic pluralism can allow us to bring different ideas to the table. It'd be really interesting to get your view on a couple of questions come in. I'll pick up my phone in a second as well. How economic pluralism can be applied to address real world economic issues. Have you got a few examples of that?
Yeah, if I skip back through, excuse me. Yeah, I think these were some attempts at some examples. I think there are others. I talked through the global financial crisis one already to some extent. I think the third one I didn't really talk about, but it's welfare policy and how to design effective labour markets. What kind of assumptions you make about labour or work are quite important. If you assume that work is always some sort of displeasure, it's a chore, something you don't really want to do, then that leads you down the line of saying, well, we have to force people to work, and therefore we have to create incentives or punishments which shove people in that direction. Now that might be necessary in some cases, but it's based upon an assumption that work is this pleasure.
Yeah.
Where it might be. Work may be an active pleasure for lots of people.
Indeed, I can vouch for that in terms of working in business, and some people really enjoy what they do, and it kind of adds a different tilt to it. How prevalent would you say kind of pluralism is in the kind of economic and academic amongst economists, kind of and academics in the community, and how does it differ from kind of different people in different industries? It'd be interesting to kind of get your experience on that, given your understanding of the topic.
Well, I mean, there's a lot. This is debatable. I mean, some people would say to me that economics is quite pluralist. There's lots of diversity, even within what I've described as mainstream economics, and I think that's arguable. There are these different perspectives, even if they share a sort of core core set of values, and we see lots of different developments within even that mainstream economics. I mentioned a couple, but something like game theory is another, which has been very important. So there is diversity in even within that, and that's where most economists are. If we're looking outside of that group, again, it depends where you mean by academia. If we're talking about economics departments, they tend to be very, very largely populated by people that I've just described, and not by people that take a very different view. If
you think actually general economic theory is adopted, and it's kind of on the extremities that pluralism is kind of trying to be introduced, and I suppose that goes with government as well. How prevalent is it kind of within government?
Yeah, I think people in government are probably less committed to a particular perspective than people in academia.
Yeah,
I think that people in government are very focused on solutions, and they're quite happy to borrow from whatever realm of theory seems to be promising. So I think they're possibly less committed to a particular view because they are focused on finding practical solutions, more than somebody that's working in an academic discipline. So I think they are slightly different. I would say that I think that for somebody working in the real world, having that pluralist approach and having that open-mindedness and that flexibility, I think is really important. So I'd certainly think that it would be a tick for somebody trying to get a job, even if it's not in economics. Well,
I'd be interested to get your view on examples of how economic pluralism can be applied to better understand or address the ramifications of kind of global challenges, COVID-19 being an example, or climate change.
Yeah, I think COVID did raise some interesting questions, and real debates about within economics, and hark back to some old themes in economics. So, for instance, something like the category of key worker was quite interesting because it sort of suggested that a way of valuing workers, which was not necessarily the same as the way the market values those workers. If you look at the Office for National Statistics data on wage rates for those key workers, actually lots of the key workers were in the very lowest paid jobs, particularly in areas like food. So that raised some quite interesting issues around how we value things, and how we say something is worth something or not. And that harks back to old debates around whether labour is productive or not, and whether we should have more productive labour or unproductive, and what that really means. So that was one interesting dimension of that COVID response. And obviously the other big interesting dimension was around employment support, and how government funded that, and their use of various different monetary and fiscal measures to try to address that need to do something about COVID. And going back to the global financial crisis, that was another example where these unconventional ideas came through. And one of the interesting things about that period was where people were talking about Hyman Minsky, people were talking about Keynes, people were even talking about Marx, to say, well, what's going on here? How have we got to this point? But also, how do we move beyond this point? And I think that we saw a similar kind of discussion around COVID and how to fund what the government wanted to do at that time. So where there was a sort of break in the norm, it did create some space for discussion of different perspectives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about the kind of media kind of communication, and how might kind of economic pluralism change the way economics is communicated in the media, or understood by the public?
Ooh, I mean, yeah, that's a great question, which I don't have an easy answer to. I mean, obviously, some part of the issue there is how the media packages its arguments and ideas, and we know that certain types of packaging are more favoured than others.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it is true that people in the public don't understand nuanced arguments. I don't think that is true, but sometimes the media acts as if it is, and packages things in a very, very an excessively simple way, I think. So I think creating space for something that's more than a quick soundbite is really important. But I'm not an expert in media and communications. I don't know how we would go about doing that. I think there's certainly an appetite. We can see that there's an appetite for different ways of thinking. We see that in all kinds of different areas. We can discuss about whether we think that's productive or not. But when people are asking questions about COVID vaccinations or about climate change or about inequality or about any of these issues, they are genuinely trying to work out what's going on. And I think if they can be exposed to ideas that help them, well, they are exposed to ideas that help them, or they think help them understand that. Again, we might have some reservations about what some of those ideas are, but I think there is a thirst to understand, there is a thirst to be open to other perspectives. So I think I don't know how we go about doing that, but I think there is an appetite.
It's very pluralism is kind of opening your eye, kind of broadening your I suppose broadening horizons to look at things from different angles, as you kind of brilliantly kind of projected with the elephant and what might be the implications of that. But the other side to that, does economic pluralism kind of become too broad, and so you end up in a kind of like it's being impractical to affect and implement kind of policy making, because you're trying to cater for too much. And so as the human mind tries to simplify things and create order, you're broadening that discussion, which is really healthy because you're looking at it from different perspectives. But can policymakers, can they incorporate it, because it suddenly starts to become so complex?
Yes, and I've not worked as a government economist, but I'm a policy advisor. But I understand that a minister, they want to be told very clearly and simply, right, what are the implications of this? I mean, there's the famous, I'm not sure whether it's even true, about the US President Harry Truman saying, give me a one-handed economist, because I don't want somebody to say on the one hand and on the other hand.
Yeah.
Just tell me how things are. So there is a demand out there for simple messaging. So you can't really communicate that to the decision maker, perhaps, but doesn't mean that you can't go through that process yourself. However, I accept that people obviously need rules of thumb that they use until they don't work. And if you're in a time-pressured environment, then looking around for all these different alternatives is not necessarily particularly practical. So I certainly think there could be a limit there of practical use. I mean, I think there are ways around that. I mean, I've looked into how the Bank of England makes its interest rate decision, and it's quite a complicated process before it gets to the Monetary Policy Committee. But you could diversify that approach even more. Different type. I mean, they do have different types of modelling approaches, but you could diversify that even more. You could diversify who's on the Monetary Policy Committee, for instance. So you could make that a bit more pluralist, and then you built that pluralism into the process, and therefore it doesn't become onerous or an extra commitment that you have to make.
Do you know of any kind of pluralist economists kind of within the government as it stands today, as in who are really kind of embracing this? Okay, well, let's look at new ideas. Let's pivot the way we're thinking.
I mean, there are some examples of pieces of work that I can that you could give. I mean, one example in particular, it's quite relevant to the topical conversation around HS2. there's something that the government uses called the Green Book, which it uses to value value things, and it uses it in environmental assessments and various other things, various other pieces of policy. And there was a document written by a colleague of mine about how you value infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so the approach that I talked about, in fact, it's on the slide now, about housing, that sort of general approach of thinking about housing as a system, and thinking much more broadly about it, underpinned this work on how you value infrastructure. So, what are the benefits of building a train line or building a bus network or whatever? Well, they're much broader than we might initially think. So that they applied that thinking to valuing infrastructure. So there's one example of where policymakers have looked for different ways of thinking, partly because they recognised that the ways that they were using before weren't perhaps giving them the satisfactory answers that they wanted.
Yeah, and maybe that comes. You mentioned some kind of not ideology, but confusing your opponent with an alternative case that is nothing to do with the argument because you want to get the policy through them. Kind of it kind of, if you broaden the argument out too much, it's kind of, you lose focus on actually what they're trying to make a decision. But yeah. I wonder, it's mainstream economic theories or economists who've been trained in those mainstream economic theories. In your view, how could they be persuaded of the importance of economic pluralism, which is effectively taking kind of alternative ideas and implementing it into their models?
Well, yes,
talks like this, I suppose, to demonstrate talks like this to demonstrate the importance of it.
Yeah, I think if you can say to people, I mean, I think you don't go into sort of threatening way and tell them that what they're doing is wrong or worthless or anything like that. Obviously, I think if you can show that what you're proposing is complementary to what they're proposing, that actually you end up with a better, a more powerful explanation. I think that that's more likely to be more persuasive than other ways of thinking about it. If you go in and sort of say, well, your models are wrong or your assumptions are wrong, then people are automatically going to be a bit more defensive. I think as well, you have to explain to people, if you understand that somebody's coming at it from a completely different perspective, you have to say, okay, this is where I'm coming from it, and try and talk to them, try and find a shared language to have a conversation about that.
And I totally agree with that. And I think what you're advocating is, so for example, marginalized communities and culture. How is that incorporated in the traditional economic model, where you might have a very different cultural look on the value of a job or the value of money or the value of a house, as you alluded to kind of earlier on, and then how does that impact the policymakers' decisions, especially when it comes to kind of community-led kind of housing? It's a really really interesting topic. That's and I think we've got one last final question in terms of why end with pluralism is at least desirable. It's essential. So there we go. That's more of a statement which kind of sums up really what you've been talking about, looking at economics from a different perspective. So thank you, James, who kind of shot that in there at the last minute. Andrew, thank you so much on behalf of all the members of the ERC and obviously kind of the community itself to kind of sharing your ideas and giving up your time this evening. And very excited about broadcasting this out to our student and university groups as well, as they understand and broaden their horizons on the meaning of economics, and how actually it's not just one perspective, it can be multiple perspectives, and that's effectively what you're encouraging, to look at economics from very different angles. On behalf of the ERC, thank you so much for your time this evening. We've really enjoyed the talk, and I hope you have a great evening, and you don't need to get home because you're already at home. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a really good event. Thank you.